Sonia Kennebeck spent years covering the paranoid world of government whistleblowers, but nothing prepared her for the secrets in her new film, Enemies of the State. I'm Tom Powers, and this is Pure Nonfiction. Sonia Kennebeck was born in Malaysia and grew up in Germany, where she started her career directing television documentaries and investigative reports. She moved to the U.S. and had a breakthrough in 2016 with her film National Bird. It profiles 3 U.S. military veterans who became whistleblowers about the government's program of drone killings. One of them is Daniel Hale.
Nobody ever thinks about speaking out against the government who's worked for them and hasn't considered what the possible consequences are. But I don't dwell on them because I don't want it to affect my voice. I don't want it to silence my words or to curtail my speech. I genuinely feel like they being the government, they being the Justice Department, they shouldn't hold that power over me. This ominous threat that they'll go after me in the same way that they've gone after so many people, especially since 9/11.
This summer, Daniel Hale was sentenced to 45 months in prison under the Espionage Act, 5 years after National Bird came out. You can read more about his case in an article linked in our show notes. National Bird won the support of Wim Wenders and Errol Morris as executive producers. It played at the Berlin and Tribeca Film Festivals and won the Ridenour Documentary Film Prize. In our interview, Sonia talks about National Bird and the latest developments for Daniel Hale. Then we move to speaking about her new film, Enemies of the State. The seed of that project was first planted while she was making National Bird. She read about the case of Matt DeHart, a former U.S. Air National Guard intelligence analyst who was being prosecuted in a murky case brought by the U.S. government. DeHart was a member of the hacktivist group Anonymous. He claimed to work with WikiLeaks as a courier for leaked government documents. In 2010, law enforcement officials raided DeHart's Indiana home on allegations of child pornography. They confiscated his computers, and DeHart was later held in U.S. detention, where he claims he was drugged and tortured. When he was released, he still faced further prosecution. At one point, he explored moving to Russia. Then he and his parents fled to Canada to seek political asylum. DeHart's father, Paul, is interviewed extensively in Enemies of the State.
No one who hasn't been through this would ever understand this. They would say, you're a retired Air Force officer, you're a pastor of a church, you're just this average American person, now you're driving your son to the Russian embassy. What's that all about? Of course, the FBI would say, well, you're a mole. But who are you going to go to? Where can you go to protect yourself from the United States of America? If the United States of America has you in their crosshairs and you think it's for something that you didn't do, but they're going to come after you anyway, where do you go?
Enemies of the State has many twists and turns. Normally on this podcast, I try not to reveal spoilers, but this time I can't avoid them for the questions I want to ask Sonia. So, before we go any further, I'd recommend you watch Enemies of the State. You can find it on VOD platforms such as Amazon or iTunes. Go ahead, pause the podcast, watch the film, and I'll wait. Okay, are you back? The film is a mind-bender, am I right? Sonia and her producer, Ines Hoffman-Kana, spent years trying to unravel the case of Matt DeHart. They started filming after he and his parents had their case for Canadian asylum rejected in 2015. The family was deported back to the U.S., and Matt took a plea deal on 2 charges of receiving child pornography. He was sentenced to prison for 90 months. Many people who closely followed his case thought the pornography charges were a bogus cover-up to persecute his work for Anonymous. He was supported by the Courage Foundation that fundraises for the legal defenses of whistleblowers such as Edward Snowden and Chelsea Manning. In the film, Sonia interviews Professor Gabriella Coleman, who studies Anonymous and followed DeHart's case closely.
Studying Anonymous already felt like being part of an exciting spy story. There was just a lot of mystery and mystique and paranoia in the study of Anonymous. But the Matt DeHart case just bumps that up to a whole different level.
Sonia and her producer Enos were left with many questions. What was on that hidden thumb drive that Matt and his family claimed the government was seeking? What was the basis for the charges of child pornography? What happened to Matt when he was in detention and claims he was tortured? For years, Sonia and Enos tried getting government officials to speak without success. Then, near the end of production, they gained access to an investigator and prosecutor on the child pornography case in Tennessee and uncovered evidence that shed new light. Here's the investigator, Brett Kniss.
According to the second victim, Matthew DeHart, under the alias of Matthew DeMarco, drove down to Tennessee to meet with the second victim. He snuck out of the house and went down the street. Matthew DeHart picked him up, took him out for dinner, took him to a gun range in another town, and gave him an Adderall and provided him with a beer. It's a classic example of grooming of the victims.
In October 2019, Matt DeHart was released from prison, and Sonia was set to interview him at his parents' home to finally ask him questions directly. In our conversation, Sonia talks about her winding path to report the case. I started by asking her how she got into the world of whistleblowers.
I've actually always been interested in national security stories, and it goes back to my times when I was studying in Washington, D.C. I had a scholarship to do an exchange here, coming from Germany and going to Washington, D.C., and I arrived just a few weeks before 9/11. And so I was actually in DC and in fact at the Pentagon the day after because I was interning with NBC News at that time. So I was very close to what happened on 9/11, and I also had 4 friends in New York who survived the World Trade Center attacks. So I think a lot of my work goes back to that experience. And after 9/11, I really wanted to understand more about the background, of the attacks and so on. And I actually studied international affairs with that in mind, and I focused a lot on security policy.
And so that establishes where your interest comes from. How did you actually start meeting the people who became the figures in National Bird?
So, finding these drone whistleblowers was actually very challenging because at that time when I started the research in early 2013, that was, before the Snowden revelations, that was before anyone from within the drone program actually spoke out publicly. And it just started first for me with curiosity because I had read about military drones and I was interested in the technology. But I thought it was strange that, drones had already at that time been used for over 10 years, and there was so little information in the public domain. So few academics were writing about it. No one from within the drone program would, widely speak out about their experiences. And that was really my goal, to find people who could, speak out from the inside. And then also, of course, very importantly, the victims and survivors of drone strikes. And I first found my lead character, Heather. I actually found her on the internet, which is kind of strange because I always tell, younger filmmakers and journalists, if you want to do original research, you have to go outside. You have to, do field research and, go and meet people. But the way I found her was that I had seen on Facebook a photograph of a young woman, and she covered up most of her face, and you could only see her eyes, and she was holding a sheet of paper, and it said something like, not everything you hear about the drone program is true. I know what I'm talking about. And from her eyes, I could see it was a very young woman. So I was wondering, does she know about military drones? And someone else had posted it. So I actually did detective work on social media, on the internet. I was cross-referencing people and see, where are they based? And through that, I eventually found my first lead character, Heather, who had worked with military drones, because I recognized her eyes on a profile photo, and I reached out to her, and she had just left the military, was in rural Pennsylvania, and I went and met her.
Heather monitored drones remotely, watching the effects of their bombs by camera.
When you watch someone in those dying moments, what their reaction is, how they're reacting and what they're doing, it's so primitive. It's really raw, stripped down death. That's what it is. This is real. Like, it's not a joke. I have specific memories of many of them that I know I killed, but it's so messy, and they don't report it down to us who we killed. Maybe we killed our objective, maybe we killed a guy who we thought was our objective. You don't know.
And then I found Daniel Hale, my second American lead character, whistleblower. I met him at a peace protest. And then the third whistleblower, Lisa Ling, I met her at a veterans convention. So those other lead characters I actually found through ground, and field research.
And what was it like winning their trust? They were in a lot of legal jeopardy. Daniel Hale has gone to prison, as I want to ask you about in a minute. But you're a relative newcomer filmmaker. You don't have an organization behind you or anything like that. So how did you win their trust?
It was, source protection, has always been very important to me. And the way I started in doing, a film about military drones was with a lot of research. So when I first met Heather, and then later on, Daniel and Lisa, I had already, put together a folder, full of research, and I had, just done, substantial reading and investigating at that time. So they saw that I didn't come into this, this research sort of naively and without, a lot of background. And in fact, I actually never studied film. I studied international affairs and politics. So I come from the content, and I think that was very important in gaining everyone's trust, because it is a very sensitive area of research, national security, working with whistleblowers, and you have to be extremely cautious, since the government does try to silence people who speak out about these type of issues. So the ground research, talking to attorneys from the beginning. I used the first money that I received for this project from ITVS, the Diversity Development Fund, to hire an attorney who specializes on First Amendment rights. And I had spoken to whistleblower attorney Jason Radak to get advice on how to safely discuss these type of subject matters with whistleblowers and sources. And that was really the starting point of my research.
So, as I mentioned before, Daniel Hale, one of the three people that one of the three whistleblowers that you profile in National Bird, was recently sentenced to prison under the Espionage Act for taking documents from the U.S. government when he worked for the U.S. government. Your film came out in 2016. His case is just been prosecuted now in 2021. I understand from reading a Washington Post article about the case that you'd written a letter in his support for his defense. Can you describe why his case, wound up being prosecuted now when the things that you were documenting were taking place many years ago?
Yeah, so when I was filming with Daniel Hale, a drone program whistleblower, kind of in the middle of production, he was raided by the FBI, and at that time, it wasn't entirely clear, at least not to me, what was going on. And his case, it was clearly, or the raid was for espionage, and it became part of the film because we decided with his attorney and with Daniel and my attorneys that we would continue documenting his case and continue filming with him. And what was so heartbreaking during the production time is that he had very little information what was going on. These Espionage Act investigations are secret. Obviously, he knows what he himself, had done during this time, but it's a very stressful period, which I know from other whistleblowers as well, because you are in this waiting period, and investigations and prosecutions under the Espionage Act are extremely harsh. Each of the counts can carry up to 10 years in prison. And Daniel, during the time that we filmed, was waiting for something to happen, an indictment or something like that. And that didn't happen for many, many years. So the film came out in 2016, and at that time, we didn't know how his case would actually, proceed. And for the years after, nothing happened, but he was still extremely impacted because he knew that he was under surveillance, because obviously the FBI had, raided him for espionage. But you are in this kind of holding pattern, and you get extremely paranoid. You can't build up trust with people because all of your communication is monitored. For me too, I had to assume that my communication was monitored because I had a lot of contact with him. He was the lead character in my film, and my attorney actually said I would be, he thought I would be raided by the FBI as well. So that is a very difficult situation for an investigative filmmaker to work under. And now, so many years later, it was 7 years after his initial raid. He actually was sentenced now, and he was charged, under Trump, and because he had given documents to another reporter, documents that are very important about the drone war. And he was sentenced to 3 years and 9 months in prison.
And so just to be clear, he had given those documents to a reporter more recently, or those were documents that he had given many years ago?
These are documents that he had given many years ago. So the sort of the time, and that's what I wrote in my letter, to the judge, that I witnessed firsthand, and you can actually see it in the film as well, how these Espionage Act prosecutions, impact people because you get so little information. There's a tremendous amount of time that passes without anything happening, but that you are being under surveillance. And what I find so problematic as an journalist, I identify as a journalist and an investigative filmmaker, is that whistleblowers provide information in the public interest. And I think especially, in this time right now where there's so much, secrecy and contradicting information and so on, it's really crucial to have, people from the inside, from the government who, provide more transparency to the public.
So let me pivot to enemies of the state. So in 2013, you're beginning work on National Bird and interviewing these whistleblowers. 2013 is also the year that Matt DeHart and his family go to Canada to seek asylum to escape the prosecution that he was under. When did you start following the case of Matt DeHart?
I heard about Matt DeHart while I was still in production for National Bird. I think it was one of my sources who had told me about Matt because, in these, sort of whistleblower circles, people were, like starting to discuss his case and said that he actually had worked with military drones, that he had served in the military. And that's why I started looking into his case. And I remember I was reading a few of his court records back then, and I thought, oh my gosh, this is really complicated. It's kind of strange, I mean, there are a lot of, documents that show that he had been, investigated and was, interviewed by the FBI, but then there was also, this child pornography case. And so my producing partner, Ines Hofmann-Kanner, and I, we decided it would be too complex to include him in a film about the drone war. But I never forgot about his case because it really is, one of the strangest stories I've ever heard about. And so when National Bird came out, I went back, into it, and and there had been more information out about his case in 2016. So I started really diving deep into the story, and I spoke to my producer Ines, and we discussed, like, can we do a film about this case. It's very complicated. It's a research rabbit hole, but it's also it's intriguing, and it has all these secrets, the national security, the government misconduct that I'm interested in to explore and investigate further. So yeah, I went on that journey, and I have to say though that I had no idea where our investigation would take us. And in fact, it took us places that I had not imagined at the beginning of our investigation.
So you're making this decision to plunge into this case in 2016. Can you situate me in where his case was at that point, where he was at physically?
We started really deeply researching in 2017. That's when I met with his parents. That's when I really started diving deep into the court records with my producing partner. And Matt DeHart at that time was actually in prison. So that was the starting point. They had been, had to return back to the U.S. When I first heard about the Matt DeHart story, the entire family was in Canada, and they were in the midst of applying for political asylum. And yeah, when we began filming in 2017, they had, returned to the U.S. and he actually had been convicted for some of the child pornography charges.
So as we see in the film Enemies of the State, you filmed extensively with his parents, Paul and Leanne, and I wonder what that experience was like. You're talking to parents who are fiercely committed to their son, who's in prison on charges that are still very hard to substantiate because lots of this case is not in the public record. You're coming off an experience of filming with very traumatized whistleblowers with whom I feel you have to have a lot of sympathy for. So I wonder if you can describe your mindset when you're interviewing the DeHart family. There are some filmmakers who, if they believed that this is an innocent person, could really feel like they're making a kind of advocacy project to to win attention to the case. And I wonder if that was ever part of your mindset.
Yeah, it's sort of like, yeah, my framework and, and where I was coming from, I think is important to the understanding of, how Enemies of the State actually starts and begins, because I was at a heightened state of paranoia. One of the lead characters of my previous film had been raided by the FBI and was under, espionage investigation. And my own attorney said, I have to watch out. I could be raided by the FBI any day. So that's definitely where I was coming from. And I had been documenting whistleblower and national security stories. And when I first sat down with Matt DeHart's parents, and they had, they told me about their own military background. They had, top secret clearances themselves, and the father had worked with the NSA. So that was the world that I was familiar with. And then they were, making these very strong, allegations, and also had documents to back them up. So that was really the starting point, and that's what is important to understand when you see the film and how it's structured. Because I wanted to be honest to the audience, with the journey that I took and that we took as a creative team. I did when I had that very first meeting with the DeHart parents. I told them that I'm only going to cover the story, make a film about this, if they are okay with me doing my own independent journalistic investigation. And that's what I, in fact, always try to clarify when I approach a film and, an investigation, that I am a journalist. I'm an investigative filmmaker. I don't actually consider myself to be, an advocate filmmaker. And I think that was crucial throughout this journey. They agreed to it. And in fact, even when the film came out at the end, they still remembered that this was, how we set out into this story and this investigation.
So you begin with access to Matthew DeHart's family and to documents that they're sharing with you that tell perhaps a persuasive story from their side. And I take it during that time you're trying to get officials in law enforcement to talk, whether from the FBI or anyone else. And my understanding is it took a long time for you to achieve that, right? I mean, can you talk about that effort and how you finally cracked through in some cases?
Yeah, this investigation was very complicated and very lengthy. It was kind of expected because, a story that has, government secrecy and different perspectives, and the FBI involved, but also, a court case about child pornography that also, for, understandable reasons has, sealed evidence and documents that would be, we knew it would be very difficult to investigate. I said to the parents we would investigate in all directions and talk to everyone involved. And that's what we really, sought out to do. And I did my investigation, the research together with my producer, Ines Hofmann-Kenner. And we went first through, all the court documents that we had access to, and not just from, the perspective of what the parents and all the activists supporting the Matt DeHart case were providing us with, but we actually, we went into Pacer and we downloaded, directly the court documents that were available. We contacted, all the attorneys around this case in Canada and the US, and then of course, the prosecution and the investigators. And they were very hard to get to. And we actually only really got access to them by doing, again, field research. we went to, Ines and I, we went to Nashville and basically stood outside the prosecutor's office and called them and said, would you like to, meet with us? We really want to discuss this case with you. It's very important for us to hear your perspective on the story.
And how deep into this project are you at this point?
So, meeting with the prosecutor, when we finally got to them, I'm trying to remember. It was probably not in the middle of production. I think when we got the interview, that was like some of the interviews we got, like the actual investigator, that was very much at the end of production. He was extremely cautious. And the prosecutor as well. We had a first meeting and they weren't, very open. They had been quite upset about the previous reporting on Matt DeHart's story. And they felt, that it was very one-sided and didn't represent it correctly. And they really didn't, want to participate. And then, we told them, you can't, complain that it is one-sided if you're not providing the other perspective and the other side. But the other thing that went kind of on parallel, which we also think, was just helpful in our discussions with the prosecutor and the investigator, and then also at the end, led to these real revelations, and the further documents and the phone calls that we received, where we filed our own court motions, Freedom of Information Act requests, public record requests, and these type of research methods, they take a really long time. Some of them are still ongoing, and it takes years. So you have to structure your research, in a way that you really begin by doing these public record requests, or begin filing court motions, because it takes a tremendous amount of time. And what's also important to me, when doing these type of investigative stories, is that it takes, and that's what people don't see, I think, on a screen or even in articles, is like, I've said before, it is like, the film is like the tip of an iceberg, and underneath is this tremendous amount of research. And just for us and for me to get to the point where I can file, a certain Freedom of Information Act request or public records request and so on, I have to read thousands of pages of court documents, and my producer has to read them too, and then we discuss it amongst each other, and that's how we develop sort of our research plan. But this is really what makes investigative filmmaking and investigative reporting so difficult and also very expensive, because you need time to dig into these complicated subjects.
Well, I want to ask you about the timeline, because when I watch the film Enemies of the State, I feel like for a long period of the film, I am steeped in the perspective of Matthew DeHart's parents, and their perspective is reinforced by other people that we see in the film. There's a judge in this case who at some point had privileged access to the documents in Matt DeHart's case and expressed skepticism over the government's position. And other journalists, one of whom you interview in Canada for the National Post, had done a deep investigation in this story and came away feeling like there was a lot of skepticism over the U.S. government's case. And then because of these things, you see in the film, there's a little bit of an echo chamber of people who are already predisposed to be suspicious of the U.S. government for a lot of good reasons. At this point, the Edward Snowden had come forward, and there had been a lot of other activity around whistleblowing, which we saw being prosecuted incredibly harshly. So there's what we experience in the film is a sense of reinforcement towards the idea that Matt DeHart is being, aggressively prosecuted because of his hacktivist work, and that there's these charges about child pornography that are a little hard to substantiate in the public record, and feel like they could be trumped up charges in order to prosecute him for his work with Anonymous. By midway or three-quarters of the way through the film, there's a lot to feel reinforced by that, and I take it that kind of reflects your own experience of spending months, if not more than a year, steeped in one side of the story before you gained access to other perspectives.
Yes, the film really follows our own journey of investigation, and I think that's important in order to understand the access that we had also to Matt DeHart's family, and it also was the starting point for us in terms of research, because that was the narrative and that was the story that was not just out there but had been written up in media publications worldwide, and which also really spread and simplified that narrative. And the other reason was one of the important documents in the film is Matt DeHart's own testimony in Canada. So this is a very, very complicated story that we had to put into a narrative structure, and I really wanted to reach that point early where Matt DeHart is telling his own story in his own words, which was the hearing room in Canada. So we had to begin this way, that they would go to Canada in the beginning, and then he goes back and retells his story from his own perspective, which does tell you a lot too about how he is presenting himself in this hearing room. It's slightly staged. We used actors who are lip syncing to the original audio, and that red thread throughout the film itself, I think, has a lot of layers, of like personal perspectives and how you spin your own story, and how you remember, like personal memory, personal perception of what the truth is. So all of that comes across through the hearing room. I introduce the prosecutor and the investigator at around minute 15 in the film, and that is really when you hear, very strongly, both of them actually are introduced, and come in and say that there's an entirely contradictory perspective, and that was something that we as filmmakers were also struggling with. First we meet the DeHart family, and they're very emotional and clearly upset about their experiences. And, we are human beings too as filmmakers. I sit in these interviews, my cinematographer, Torsten Lapp, and I, we were impacted by their testimonies. And then, while into our research, we finally get to the interviews of, the prosecutor and the investigator, and they actually have a similar, involvement, like personal involvement in this case, and are also, strongly believe in their perspective.
With, we should say, a different set of victims.
Exactly.
Two minors who the prosecutors believe were sexually groomed by Matt DeHart on the internet.
Yes. So the prosecutor and the investigator are really not just speaking for themselves, but they are speaking to the victims of, Matt DeHart, child pornography victims. So that is another, very emotional part of the story. And all of a sudden, we're dealing with entirely conflicting testimonies. And that is really...
So let me pause you there, because as a viewer, there's a point that I reach in the film where I'd been strongly persuaded of one thing, strongly persuaded that the U.S. government was over aggressively pursuing someone, engaged in an act of good of exposing U.S. government secrets. And then there comes a point in the film where I realize that that there is a different side to this story, and that all this emotional investment that I've put into believing one thing is now being challenged. And as a viewer, it's startling enough to experience that, based on having given up an hour or 75 minutes of your time watching this movie up until that point where it really starts to sink in that something is different. So that was emotionally upsetting for me just as a viewer. I'm curious to know how it was for you and Enos, having invested months in trying to process this story, to confront, a different set of facts.
For us as filmmakers, it was extremely challenging. I'm not going to hide it, and I'm sure you will hear the same from Enos as well. It was very difficult and challenging for all of us on the team. We are a small creative team, entirely independent, and to invest our lives into a film and a story that turns out to have so many conflicts and contradictions, and it also took us places that we honestly didn't think we would get to in our even in the worst case scenarios, was very upsetting. And also, very, very challenging, for us as a team that really goes into, high risk national security stories, investigations, where we want to uncover government misconduct and social justice, and they shine light on important social justice issues, and we do believe in the government, mistreating people, because we've seen it firsthand. We've seen, harsh prosecutions. We know in American jails and prison how people, in particular people of color, are being, really badly mistreated. So, that was like the starting point. It's like some of the conspiracy theories are true, and these things happen. Government torture, mass surveillance, the drone strikes, election interference, like all what whistleblowers have presented to the public. And so that was the mindset we went into the story, really uncovering what the FBI's role in this is. And then all of a sudden, that one narrative that the Hart family had presented, and that was really covered in reputable publications worldwide, just became a lot more complex. And was also, and there's not just two perspectives, and that was what we were trying to, dig through and process too, as, filmmakers and journalists. There's the Hart family, they're the victims' families, there's prosecuting investigators, but then there are, all these different perspectives of the variety of attorneys that the Hart family had. And they don't, they have all different narratives. The judge, of course, but then the National Guard, the FBI, people who hung up, phones on us, the FBI that said, no one, no former current employee or contractor, should give any assistance to this project. That's a very extreme statement. We actually had scheduled an interview with the National Guard, and we had booked flights already. And the weekend before, I think the Friday, we were supposed to be there on Sunday or Monday, the Department of Defense intervened, and the interview was canceled last minute. So all these things were happening at the same time, and we really had to dig through and process. And that's why the film is, structured in this way too, because it's I think it's important for the audience to go through the same journey, and in fairness to everyone involved, to really, understand what we were going through as a film team, as journalists, and go through this process of like questioning your own, beliefs, what you want to believe, who you want to believe, and really, scrutinize yourself and the story. And I really want to, I hope people will come out of this and, understand the value of critical thinking, not to form your own narratives and speculations.
So as I wrap this up, I want to ask you about the last scene in the film. You've been following this case for a number of years. Matt DeHart is finally released from prison, so you're going to have a chance to interview him. By that point, you have really heard a different perspective and had evidence presented that is very persuasive that the child pornography charges against him were accurate and that there were real victims in that case. Describe for me how you prepared yourself to be interviewing him, shortly after he had gotten out of prison.
Yeah. So the interview with Matt DeHart was at the very end of our production. And at that point, we had actually received new evidence. And that was throughout the film, because there's so much he said, she said in this case, and a lot of secrecy. What we were always looking for was evidence and documents. And you see a lot of documents in the film. I tried to present everything that I could really verify. And then also on screen, we are disclosing when we received certain information, like the unsealed court documents. That was a turning point. The new evidence with the phone calls and the additional, evidence of additional victims. And so that was all when we received it, very close to the actual interview with Matt DeHart. And what was important to us and to me was to present him and ask his perspective. That is like, it's really always, there was like the line throughout the film, we're finding new information, we are confronting the people, and we're presenting the information, we get their perspective. And so, from attention, what you see in the film, what the questions you have as an audience, that was building up in me as well. So I had a long list of questions for our independent team. To schedule such an interview is a big deal because it's very expensive. And we had talked not only to Matt, but his parents about it, and his attorney, who was actually on call that day. And what is so mysterious about the interview that never happened is that we filmed with Matt DeHart the morning of the interview. So we had met with him and his parents the night before, my director of photography and I. And in the morning, we filmed Matt walking towards his parents' house. So the man you see walking towards his parents' house, that is the real Matt. The person's playing Scrabble with his parents, that's the real Matt DeHart. It was actually an original, real, verite scene. And then we just took a break, and we were, we wanted to set up for the interview, and give them some time while we were setting up. And then I think the interview was around 4 p.m. or so, and then at 4:05 I received a phone call from a not anonymous number, and it was Matt, and he said, I can't do the interview. And we were shocked, we were rattled. We had set up the interview for like 2 hours, and everything was so well organized and planned, and it was entirely unexpected. And and I really have to say, I have not received a clear answer yet to why he hasn't showed up. He was talking about an attorney, but we were in touch with his attorney, so it must have been another attorney possibly. But yes, I think that scene is a statement in itself, The Empty Chair.
And since the film has come out, played at film festivals in the fall. Now it's out in theaters and in general release. Have you gotten any further feedback from either Matt DeHart or his family or anyone else kind of pertinent in this case?
Yes, we actually try to do pretty extensive preparation for our lead characters. So, with Matt DeHart and his family, of course, we all had to process him not showing up for the interview. So that took a while. It was upsetting for our film team, but we got back in touch a few weeks later, and then because we were so far ahead in our editing, and we're about to finish the film, once we actually locked the film and got it ready for release, we actually do sort of a process of walking the lead characters through the film, so they understand what's in it, and can process it and ask me questions. I explain why I made certain choices, and Matt actually said when I explained again, this is journalistic, there's a lot of he said she said in the film, but I also explained the additional evidence and so on, and he actually said he expected that we would have a journalistic approach, and he actually appreciates it. So that was his reaction. We've also been in touch with the investigator and the prosecutor, and they are happy as well. They actually like the way they are represented in the film, that it shows their perspective. The investigator actually wrote to us and said, he thinks it could bring a certain closure to the victims' families as well. So the feedback so far from the participants has been good.
And what about the wider circles of people who became very convinced about Matt DeHart's stories and had written about it and blogged about it and tweeted about it? Some of which you document in the film. Have you seen a different reckoning with that story?
So, of course, the people who were most closely involved in the Matt DeHart case were the investigative journalist Adrian Humphreys and then Professor Gabriella Coleman, who really, very strongly, believed the family's perspective of the story. And it's also, I think what's important is that there are, still there's ambiguity, and some shades of gray. There's certainly, the victims and the victims' families in the child pornography case, which, we could, really find very important, new evidence. But the FBI and the mistreatment in the jail, that, we have evidence for that as well. So it's really, it is a very kind of complex case. But the professor and the journalist, you can see on screen, they were quite impacted by the new information we were able to get, and it took them quite a while to process it as well. And I think Gabriella's soundbite, the professor, is crucial when she says,
I think we often establish stories and narratives with incomplete information, and then activists and advocates take a stance, just hoping that's the right thing. And then stories get written and Wikipedia pages get written, and it takes a life of its own as being truth. If we ever want to live in a world where we can trust the truth, it also means having to reevaluate evidence as new things come up. It can maybe change your mind.
Yeah, so far, we've had people who've screened it from the, hacking community, from the activist communities. And what I find, and I'm very happy that it comes across, but what's been important to me is that people understand that this case is complex. And that's what there was, for me, this film has always been more than just about one individual case. It is, it's a commentary on the way that information spreads and gets perpetuated and also simplified on social media and the internet, and then how people repeat it. Like some of the articles that I read, it was like a game of telephone. The story changed when it was repeated. And what I want to challenge people with in this film is to, take a step back and really, dig through and watch a story that has more complexities, that has, still ambiguities, and, get comfortable with it. And I didn't want to try and fill the gaps and the secrecy that's still in it with speculation. And people, this is like real life. Like, not everyone is either hero or villain. There are, and we're used to these narratives, but human behavior and people and human action is, they're very complex and they're very contradictory, and multiple things can happen and be true and possible at the same time.
I want to thank Sonia Kennebeck for speaking with me, and thanks to her producer, Ines Hoffman-Kana, for her help. Their film about the case of Matt DeHart, Enemies of the State, is now available on demand. So is their previous film, National Bird, about whistleblowers on the U.S. military drone program. Their latest film, U.S. vs. Reality Winner, is currently rolling out at film festivals. Thanks to our team, series producer Hannah Norden-Swan and web designer Cross Strategy. Our theme music is composed by Andre Williams, and our executive producer is Raphael Nehausen. I'm Tom Powers. You can follow me on Twitter at THOMPowers. You can read our show notes and sign up for our newsletter at purenonfiction.net.